second. Well, so let's see. For those residents who were not here, I did present the neuroleptics, this first lecture that I made. The second one was about mood stabilizers, and the third one about anti-anxiety medications. So I tried kind of different formats, and I didn't get any feedback. So I don't know for sure if you consider it more useful and more interactive kind of discussion or a lecture style. And this one I made it the lecture style. I kind of stuck with the tradition. So this one is called Psychoanatomy. You probably know about neuroanatomy. Well, I would like to start a push for what we are going to call a psychoanatomy. And why am I saying this? Because I am a big believer that the mind, no matter how complex and refined and how puzzling it is still just a function of the brain. It is still just about microcurrents based on biochemical processes that run through neurons. That's pretty much all that is. Nothing really too fancy. It's definitely a very complex function of the human animal, but it's still nothing but biology in this. And as any biological function, it has a substrate. That substrate is the mind, the brain. And I think that it will get to that point where we are going to be able to pinpoint very accurately what is going wrong in each of these so-called pure psychiatric disorders. You are not going to have an anatomic lesion like in neurology, but you're going to have some biochemical lesions. So let's see, just 1 second. Okay, here it is. I guess now you have access to the slides. So Thomas Hobbes, a very interesting character. He's a philosopher, English philosopher. He lived in 1600s. He wrote the most famous book of his. He wrote many books, but the most famous is Leviathan, 1616, written in 1616. Thomas Hobbes was a kind of interesting character. He was born prematurely. Actually, it is said that his mother, when she heard about the Spanish Armada invading, they eventually did beat them down at Trafalgar by Admiral Nelson, if you remember. But anyway, the initial news that Spain is mounting an armada of hundreds and hundreds of ships really scared the heck out of them. And that's when he was born, actually, prematurely. He was very sickly as a kid, but the irony was that he lived to be 91. So he lived a long life. He saw many other people who were much stronger, so-called, and much healthier die before him. He came in Leviathan with this syllogism. Syllogism is an argument composed of two premises and a conclusion. Premise one, all men are animals. Premise two, all animals are made of matter. Therefore, they obey the natural laws of matter. And his conclusion, it's again, he was, of course, attacked plenty and derided for that conclusion. The society of men doesn't need anything spiritual to discipline. They just need a very strong leader, an absolute monarch. Well, this kind of views, actually, and I think that he had this kind of views because he was in the employee of Lord Cavendish, a big name in politics at that time. And but because of this staunch monarchism, he had to flee and take refuge in Paris when the English Civil War happened. So if you remember the story with Cromwell, who led the parliamentarian group against the monarchy, and he ended up, that means Cromwell, he ended up condemning to death Charles I, the King Charles I, and ended the monarchy for a little bit. Well, in those very problematic times, what is a monarchist supposed to do? Well, run. He ran to Paris, where he stayed for a decade. You got to know there quite a few philosophers. He had a kind of a thorny relation with Descartes as well, who was a very spiritual guy. who never denied God. But while Thomas Hobbes never kind of pick up any war with the religion, he did have this very how do you call it, cynical view about about mankind in general. So he thought that the society of man needs a strong hand. Otherwise, the life of the humans is going to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So I really like that phrase. It's pretty famous in philosophy. So he was a kind of a down-to-earth, cynical guy who felt that there is really nothing special about men or humans. They're not inculcated with some kind of divine spirit. So from that kind of view that started in 1600, we go further in time to Paul Ivan Yakovlev, actually Pavel Ivan Yakovlev, because he's a Russian. He was born in Russia. He managed to escape after the Russian Revolution. He managed to escape, and he was a pretty brilliant mind. He ended up teaching in Harvard. So he came up with the idea of organizing the structure of the brain in a very simple, straightforward manner. So he postulated that there is a median zone, a paramedian zone, and a supralimbic zone. These regions of the central nervous system are concerned with very clear, well delineated functions. The median zone is the one that takes care of the basics. That means of the respiration, of the circulation, of the gastrointestinal system, and is concerned with energy metabolism in general. This part of the brain is present at birth and fully functional at birth. Now, also very interesting little detail. This median zone, about this median zone, let me see, here it is, here. So the very interesting about this median zone, it contains also some formations that you are very familiar with. They are actually in the brainstem, and they stretch a little bit into the midbrain. These are two famous structures, the reticular ascending activating system, or the reticular nuclei, and the dorsal raphe nuclei. You are familiar with these two names, probably. The reticular activating ascending system is the one who projects into the thalamus and from there into the cerebral cortex, and is responsible for alertness. Damage to the system is going to result in coma. Now, the posterior dorsal raphe nuclei, or posterior raphe nuclei, are famous because they have a major role in depression. They are serotonergic centers, and all the medications for the treatment of depression enhance the serotonin transmission. So these are part of the median system, the median zone, responsible for the basic function of the body. Now, the paramedian or the limbic zone, the part of the slide that you see represented in blue, is the limbic zone. The limbic zone has some structures that derive from telencephalon. To kind of a little reminder here, the three primary vesicles from which all the central nervous system develops are the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. The prosencephalon gives rise to telencephalon and diencephalon. The mesencephalon becomes eventually the midbrain, that portion between the pons and the cortex and the cerebral hemispheres. And then the rhombencephalon will give rise to the pons and cerebellum, and the lower part to the brainstem. So you have in the limbic system structures that are derived from the diencephalon, and these are the thalamus and hypothalamus. Some people include the epithalamus. Let me also change and go to the other part of the screen that I wanted to show you. So let's see. Okay, so how is this called? Screen, and let's see, this one. Okay. So now we go to the a very nice representation of the limbic system in isolation, and that's a very rare occasion to look at this and turn it on all facets and be able to identify all structures. In fact, I tried this exercise in the collaborative way part of the presentation or the style of presentations. And I don't know to what extent it worked, but let's review it now. So this is the limbic system. Practically, the structures derived from the diencephalon are the hypothalamus, which is this one here, hypothalamus. And as you see here, it contains the pituitary stalk and the pituitary gland. Hypothalamus is the vegetary brain. In a way, it kind of regulates all the mechanics of this machinery that the brain sits on top of, which we call the body, the physical body. Then we have the hippocampus with this part, pes anserinus, the anterior part. Pes anserinus means duck foot. And then you have cornua monis. Cornua monis is the horn of the devil. It has this C shape part, and on top of it sits the hippocampus fimbria, the fimbria hippocampi, that continues into the fornix, that ends up into the mammillary body. Mammillary body are actually anatomically part of the hypothalamus, and they contain the mammillary nuclei. Then we have the thalamus, but only the anterior part of the thalamus is considered part of the limbic system. Is also derived from, it's also, thalamus is actually derived from the telencephalon. Then you have the cortical limb, the cortical part of the limbic system, which are some gyri of the cerebral cortex, and this is the cingulate gyrus. It's called cingulate. Cingulum in Latin means it means belt, and it surrounds the base of the brain like a belt. But cingulum, actually, there is an anatomical formation called cingulum, which is a tract of white matter, and it is in the depth of this cingulate gyrus, and that's where it comes. That's where the name comes from, the cingulum, which actually is a tract of white matter that is behind this this formation, the gyrus itself. And then we have the hippocampus with the Here you see the hippocampus, and here in brown or reddish brown, you see the parahippocampal gyrus. Some people also include in the limbic system the olfactory bulbs and the olfactory tract, and also the piriform cortex and the entorhinal cortex. Different textbooks may give you different accounts from about what is contained in the limbic system. Now, also in the limbic system, you have the brain, the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia look like this. So these are basal ganglia in isolation, and you see the putamen, the caudate. Caudate has a tail, therefore the name caudate. And then you have the globus pallidus, which is visible here on the medial part of the putamen, and it's considered that the putamen doesn't have anything to do with the limbic system. But sorry, globus pallidus doesn't have anything to do with the limbic system. The putamen and the caudate, they do. The dorsal medial part is in connection with the hemispheres. Let me see if they. Yeah, well, it's kind of obliterated completely. So as you see, the dorsolateral of part of the basal ganglia, the putamen and the caudate nucleus, are in connection with the several hemispheres. But the ventromedial part The ventromedial part has major connections with the limbic system. So therefore, they are considered, at least functionally, part of the limbic system. So let's go back to the slides. Just 1 second. And the slide here. Okay. Okay, so this is the limbic system, or the paramedian zone. That part is responsible for emotions, motivations, for the behavioral expression of emotions as well. And it's present in reptiles. Phylogenetically speaking, it's present already in reptiles. The reptiles do have a cortex as well, but very primitive. They have only that variety of cortex that we call allocortex, older form of cytoarchitectonic, which is composed only of 3 layers. The humans also have a neocortex composed of 6 layers. This is present in other mammals as well, but is not to the extent that is present in humans. In humans, actually, it comprises 80% of the cortex, which is much more than in any other mammalian species. So the supralimbic zone is actually the cortex, and the cortex again is typical for mammals, and only the primates have a very heavy representation of the neocortex, which is a more complex form of cortex. So obviously the cortex is responsible for the conscious perception. The cortex is divided functionally into primary sensory and primary motor areas, from where the information flows to the unimodal association areas. And from there, the perception is assembled in a more complex representations in the heteromodal association areas, where input from a variety of senses are coming in. Now, the cortex, the limbic system, is what I would call psychoanatomy. So that's where most of the concern in psychiatry resides. It revolves around the limbic system and the closely associated areas. So again, the prefrontal cortex is practically the chief operating officer of the whole CNS. And some people go as far as including the whole prefrontal cortex in the limbic system. But the reality is that these are a minority of people. The prefrontal cortex is considered just a kind of a strong collaborator of the limbic system, but not part of it. It's a little bit like the prefrontal cortex is the rational part of a human, and the limbic system is the emotional part. They cannot exist without each other. People tend to look at emotions in a kind of dismissive way. Well, in my opinion, nothing will move in this society without the emotions, which are in the responsibility of the limbic system. So you cannot say that one is more important than the other. Actually, as I mentioned, the limbic system is responsible for motivation. So if motivation isn't there, the rational part of the brain is not going to do pretty much anything. It's not going to take on any task. So they pretty much need each other. Now, I don't have a, yeah, so it doesn't go. I don't have a cursor to show you, but if you look at the hippocampus, and at the structure called fimbria hippocampus, you see that it stretches into the fornix, and it surrounds, makes a circle around the base of the brain, and ends up into the mammillary nuclei. From the mammillary nuclei, you see a connection with the anterior thalamic nucleus. That means with the thalamus, and then from the thalamus you see a connection with the cingulate gyrus. So this is a very important circuit because this is what James Pepys postulated, that is the source of emotions. So James Pepys was actually an American. When I was studying medicine in Romania, all of us were convinced that Pepys, which we pronounced Papez, was actually a Spanish guy. But no, it turns out that he is American-born in Midwest. He was a neurologist and neuroanatomist who worked in Cornell University. And in the paper, A Proposed Mechanism of Emotions, which he published in 1937, he presented this scheme. This is the original scheme that was presented in the paper 1937, and that was a notion, a scientific discovery that kind of stood the test of time. Of course, it's much more elaborate nowadays, but in principle, as you saw in the other scheme, this circuit exists, is well established. That means the hippocampus does communicate with the mammillary body through the fornix, which connects to the thalamus, which connects to the cingulate gyrus, and the cingulate gyrus pushes the information back into the hippocampus through the parahippocampal gyrus. So that's a very important circuit for psychiatry, because we are concerned a lot with emotional problems. So another circuit that I cannot really kind of show you, but try to start with those red areas called the brainstem and ventral tegmental area. So you see the brainstem and the ventral tegmental area connecting to the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus you see connection with the septal nuclei and with nucleus accumbens. So that is another famous circuit in psychiatry called the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway. So this is the target of a lot of psychiatric medications, and also is a pathway responsible for addiction as well. So this connection between the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens is the place where things go wrong when you have an individual who got addicted to street drugs, alcohol, or now I have to add marijuana as well, because marijuana is technically legal in many states. In New York State, it's just legal for so-called medicinal purposes. So I have an opinion about that, but do not forget a very nice workaround when people come to you and they tell you, I am taking medical marijuana. Actually, I have now a patient in this situation. She, a woman, is taking medical marijuana. And once she texted me saying, is it safe for me to come to the office? And I was saying, of course it's safe. I texted her, of course it's safe. And then when she showed up, she asked her, what's that about? What do you mean it's safe? Why would it not be safe? And she said, well, I don't know. I just had this fear that there is something fishy going on at the office. And I was very uncomfortable coming, but I know it's silly. And I told her, you know what? I think that this so-called medical marijuana, she was taking it every day, vaping and some edibles. I told her, look, this medical marijuana is causing some trouble. And she started protesting. This is the only thing that helps my pain. Do you want me to go back on opioids? And I said, well, you know, it's going to be your choice. But like any medication, marijuana will have some problems, will have the so-called side effects. And if you are okay with this distortion of your reality testing, I didn't use those words, but if you are okay with perceiving the reality a little bit skewed, then yeah, go ahead. But you must be informed that this thing that you just experienced is a psychotic manifestation of the use of marijuana, the chronic use of marijuana. And actually, I had much more prominent manifestations of this kind. I remember a kind of really a very dramatic case was a journalist who was in India for an assignment, and he ran into a cheap and strong supply, variety and supply of marijuana. And he just lost control with this marijuana. He came back completely psychotic. First of all, he ended up being beaten on the streets of Bombay and waking up in a hospital, not knowing what happened. Anyway, he came to United States and he was still intensely psychotic. I mean, he was bizarre. He believed in paranormal manifestations. He believed that he had some power, clairvoyant power, sees through people and so on. I hated to disappoint him, but I told him that is the marijuana. He agreed to take some neuroleptics, but more importantly, he agreed to stop the marijuana. And things went back to normal to the point that he went on with his career. So another gentleman who went to Scotland for a semester abroad, the first time the kid was the first time out of the control of his parental figures, and the same marijuana, major psychotic symptoms. He came back believing that he has unusual powers. He was very kind of spiritual, and he believed that he's very insightful. And at the end, I had to burst his bubble, and I told him, "This is really the marijuana." He did stay on neuroleptics for about, I would say, 3 months, and after that, the neuroleptics were gone, and he is fine. He is now back in college. He's doing okay. So he's a little bit eccentric, but it's kind of a very nice representation of what this circuit can do, what major pathology it can cause. So another circuit that it would be nice for you to pay attention is the one that links the amygdala to the nucleus accumbens, septum nuclei, and hypothalamus, and then back to amygdala. This is a circuit which is going to give you the emotional color that you see in people who are under the influence of a intense emotional state. So that means the expression of their face, the posture, the tone of the voice. So all of this is going to be mediated by this circuit. And of course, most importantly, the manifestations of anger and fear. So they are modulated by this circuit. So this is a kind of simplified version of the limbic system that you can maybe easier remember. The green, how to call it, bubbly part is the amygdala, and behind it you see the hippocampus, which continues with the fornix that surrounds the under the corpus callosum, the base of the brain ends up in the mammillary body, and and also with green you see the olfactory bulbs and olfactory tract together with the entorhinal and piriform cortex. Actually, the olfactory bulbs are sitting on the entorhinal and piriform cortex. So they are considered also in some grouping, they're considered part of the limbic system. Now it's going to be a series of tables which are the result of rather very meticulous studies looking at people who have lesions in certain areas of the brain, and isolating only the psychiatric problems that can come out of it. Now, this is coming from neuropsychiatry. Neuropsychiatry is concerned with anything that happens with the mind as a result of a concrete anatomical destruction that happen either as a result of a stroke or a tumor or a germ or a bacteria or of this malfunction of the brain that we call epilepsy. So there is also a closely related, I would say, borderline discipline in neurology called behavioral neurology. So behavioral neurology is mostly concerned not with more esoteric issues like emotions and cognitions. They are concerned, I mean, with cognition they are concerned, but they're concerned with sensorial deficits and very practical, clearly present or easy measurable in problems like visual spatial neglect or agraphia or aphasia. So this is the behavioral neurology. The neuropsychiatry is concerned with more lofty parts of the mind that do not stand out very easily as pathology. For example, depression. Depression is not something that stands out. I mean, especially in situations in which the depression comes as a result of some kind of identifiable stressor in people's lives, it is very difficult to be perceived by the patient as a illness, as a malfunction of the brain. And sometimes they even react in a manner as if they are insulted. It's like, hey, wait a minute, didn't you hear me? I lost my job. My wife walked out on me, and you are telling me that I have a disease. So you have to be cautious how you handle this situation. But the reality is that yes, you cannot let yourself be influenced by a sad story. The reality is that if you take 100 people and you put them in exactly in the same situations as the patient is going through, you are going to be surprised how small the number of people is going to be that will experience the syndrome or the set of symptoms that we call major depressive disorder. Actually, I myself, I'm not very happy with this name, major depressive disorder, because people do not even make a distinction between sadness and depression. So they use it interchangeably, and that's okay. Language is a living concept. It will add and subtract all sorts of things, which will change the way they use words. So that's okay. That's it's an evolution that happens with the language. And unfortunately, this evolution made these two ideas of depression and sadness converge. Well, depression is not just sadness; is sadness plus increase appetite, increase sleep, decrease in energy level, and so on. So it's these kind of problems are very difficult to recognize by the patient, even by the people around the patient as problematic. But anyway, I was saying these are structures that if they suffer some kind of problem, you will see manifestations that are really reminiscent of what we deal with in psychiatry all day long. For example, the temporal cortex. If you have a stroke, a tumor, a hotspot of epilepsy in that area, you are going to get psychosis. And do not forget, psychosis means the presence of any of the three items, either hallucinations, either or delusions, or marked thought disorganization. So this is what we call psychotic. So that's what happens if you have a tumor pressing on the temporal cortex. You are going to get auditory hallucinations. If you have Alzheimer's disease, which starts eating into the temporal cortex, which actually happens in more advanced forms, stages of this illness, you may get delusions, especially delusions of being robbed, quite a few of those. And why? Because people forget where they put stuff. or forget where the furniture is, and they will start imagining that people are coming and stealing stuff from them, or rearranging the furniture as a sign, or as a sign that someone was there in their absence. So the same for the striatum. Striatum is actually the putamen and caudate. Caudate and putamen are the striatum. So these lesions of the basal ganglia, like it happens in Huntington's disease, and other illnesses that affect the structure of the basal ganglia, can lead to manifestations that are indistinguishable from schizophrenia. And as you see in the lesions of the striatum, schizophrenia appears. So practically, the research shows that in schizophrenia, there are problems with the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are not functioning as they should. Depression is, again, as I said before, a little more difficult to pick up, but it so consistently happens when you have a stroke, or a Huntington's disease, or Parkinson, that affects anatomically the basal ganglia, the thalamus, the insula, the orbitofrontal cortex. Then you will have the symptoms of depression. And as you see, exactly the same like in psychosis, in depression also is mentioned the idiopathic depression as a cause for structural or neurochemical modifications of these anatomical formations. That means basal ganglia, thalamus, insula, the medial orbitofrontal cortex. Now, interestingly, the other side of the depression, that means the mania, can also be caused in certain lesions of the very same structure. That means basal ganglia. Sometimes you get depression, but sometimes you get the opposite, mania. And Huntington's disease is actually pretty notorious for causing people to become manic, and their behavior becomes very unpleasant for the rest of the family, because it's a mania combined with a dementia. That means very little logic and reason accompanies this manic decompensation. So people can do quite a bit of damage to their social support system. Now, the amygdala is notorious. I spoke in the last presentation about anti-anxiety medications about the role of amygdala and what happens if you destroy it. The Kluver-Bucy syndrome, characterized by placidity, among others. That means people, they just lose the ability to get angry. They are no longer angry. And this happens with people, but also with animals, because Kluver-Bucy syndrome was first demonstrated in monkeys. Bucy was the neurosurgeon who executed the ablation of the amygdala, and Kluver was the psychologist who studied these monkeys and established the manifestations of the lesion in this area of the brain. So amygdala is the center of the brain that modulates anger and fear. That means a flight or fight response. And obviously is going to be very much implicated in the PTSD. In PTSD, actually, there are some studies showing that the amygdala swells in volume once a person becomes symptomatic. And of course, a lot of other phobias are modulated by amygdala. As you see in amygdala, when it comes to damage to the amygdala, the information we have that there is some damage there is actually in psychiatric illnesses themselves, not stroke, not traumatic events, just a psychiatric illness itself can cause damage to the amygdala, and you have all the resulting symptoms. Then you have the addiction. So The addiction is really a very omnipresent issue in psychiatry. It's a uninvited guest that when it shows up on the scene is going to mess up everything. So no matter what you are suffering of, if you hear that there is addiction involved, you are going to have to expect a very rocky ride. The medications do not work as good. The people are going to be very unreliable, and their compliance with medication decisions is going to be very poor. I did mention in the first presentation about a system called shared decision making, and I want to kind of bring it up into your attention. Shared decision making means that you actually do not tell people what to do. You just put in front of them some options, not too many, because in psychiatry, actually, there are quite a few, if you are, depending on how creative you are and how educated in these matters you are, you're going to come up with many options, but you cannot overwhelm people. And you cannot give them the impression that you are randomly throwing some names at him or her. So you have to reduce it. Usually I never give people more than 3 options. And I describe the pros and cons of each, and the patient takes a decision. But guess what? That works in most of the patients, but the people who have problems with addiction, they are not going to be able to implement what they themselves decided. So it's a major problem in psychiatry. And as I mentioned before, there is any kind of damage in the mesolimbic pathways can trigger problems of disengaging from a substance that causes a tiny pulse of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. By the way, the ventral tegmental area is the part of the whole structure that causes cravings and causes the drug-seeking behavior. So cravings and drug-seeking behavior are moderated by the ventral tegmental area. The pleasure that people feel when they take the drug is actually the nucleus accumbens. So they are when people start having these intense cravings and they would sell the shirt of their back for the next hit, it's actually the ventral tegmental area which is lightening up like crazy. Let's see, the OCD, a very kind of interesting part, very interesting correlation with the anatomical formations in OCD, especially the basal ganglia. There can be other problems which result in OCD, like damage to the orbitofrontal cortex. That means that part of the frontal lobe that sits on the orbit. So the orbitofrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, the thalamus can all result in OCD symptoms, but the basal ganglia really have a important role because of the syndrome called PANDAS. Not important role, but let's say a little more famous, well known, and you have to know about it as well. The PANDAS are the post-streptococcal immune disturbance that results in inflammations of the basal ganglia. And this inflammation is going to result in kids getting OCD symptoms, and sometimes very disruptive, prominent, and more resistant, let's say, more stubborn when it comes to attempts to treat it. So the orbitofrontal cortex is the site of the site that can cause a lot of personality alterations. Actually, there is a famous case of a Texas A&M shooter. Yeah, there was maybe some of you know about it.
Is that the clock tower guy?
Clock tower, yes, that's right. So you know about the incident. Yeah, so it turned out that he had actually a brain tumor pressing on the orbitofrontal cortex, and there is some other damages as well. So this is a guy who was actually normal, but then all of a sudden he just took a scope, a rifle with a scope, and went into the water tower or some kind of a tower. I don't know what it was, and started shooting people randomly on the campus of the A&M. So it made quite a bit of. It was quite shocking for everybody. Obviously, I cannot abstain myself from mentioning the Phineas Cage incident. So you probably know about it. There's a railroad worker who got practically hit in the head with a rod that actually went all the way through the orbit and kind of took off on the other side on the top of his head. So he was. How to call it a case that attracted a lot of attention because the man was absolutely conscious actually on the way to the doctor. He stopped at the pub and drank a few shots and then he went to the doctor. Anyway, he survived, but he really was changed. John Martin Harlow, the doctor that treated him, has in his notes that he made about this case that he was a hardworking, responsible, the most efficient and capable foreman before the accident. After the accident, he is Harlow, the doctor, is describing him as fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desire. So he became like a kid without self-control. But he lived a long life, actually. He ended up going to Chile and working for some kind of coach, stage coach. But he definitely was never the same. So let's see. The amnesia. The other one that I want to direct your attention to is the hippocampus. That's kind of a big one. Obviously, anything that affects the hippocampus is going to affect the memory. And to remind you, there are several kinds of memory: the immediate short-term, which are for seconds or minutes, and then the long-term memory, which is divided as well into declarative or semantic memory and the procedural. So procedural means that everything that you do with how to call it, with your body, with your hands, that you cannot explain. For example, dance is the ultimate procedural kind of activity. You say, well, you are able to describe what you do. You can describe steps in a specific dance move, but the truth is that this is really something that you do. Even if you explain to somebody how the movements are done, you are not going to see that person jumping and doing that particular dance. So there's a procedural memory. Doesn't really have to do anything with the hippocampus. Therefore, is not affected in traditional dementias like Alzheimer dementia, for example. But the declarative semantic memory is encoded by the hippocampus. That means it passes through the hippocampus. The structure must be intact to be able to retain, to use short-term memory, to keep, for example, a phone number in your mind until you get to a pen and paper to put it down. That's short-term and immediate memory. But also the declarative memory needs the hippocampus in the initial stages, because the memories are eventually stored are distributed into the hemispheres, into the cerebral hemispheres. They're not located in the hippocampus. That means once they are prepared and they are processed by the hippocampus, they kind of end up residing in the cortex. And if you destroy the hippocampus, those long-term memories are not going to fade away. Long-term memory and also the declarative memory is not going to fade away after if the consolidation of the memory happened before the hippocampus was affected. As you see, kind of functions that are how to call it, a very well defined or delineated, are also have a corresponding anatomical part that if injured, they are going to create a problem. And all the last thing that I'm going to say is that you do see hypersexuality sometimes in the frontotemporal dementia. And look what is written here: the orbitofrontal cortex, when destroyed by tumors or trauma, and frontotemporal dementia can lead to people becoming hypersexual. Actually, it happened to Bush first president. There were some rumors that he started making some inappropriate comments to his caretakers, and I think that it was probably a form of dementia that was setting in. So the last slide, I would like to kind of remember that the mind is you can think about the mind like a computer. In the sense that you have the software, which is the collection of beliefs, perceptions, and the patterns of reaction, and then you have the hardware, and the hardware are the neurons and the biochemistry. You can influence both when you try to repair a problem of psychiatric nature. The software part is repaired by psychotherapy. The hardware part is repaired by medication. And do not forget, as psychiatrists, that is our competitive edge. Competitive advantage. Psychotherapy can be done by social workers and psychologists. The hardware part, that means the brain structures and the brain biochemistry, cannot be influenced by anybody but our profession. So we'll see then next time is going to be actually about the biochemistry of the brain. So we talked about the anatomical formation, and now we are going to speak the next time about the neurochemistry of the brain and its relation with psychiatric illness. Well, so if you have any comments, just send me a text or an email. If you have any preferences regarding the format of these presentations, let me know. So I'll see you next time then.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Wachescu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.